you. Firstly, thank you for inviting me this evening to do a presentation on the rise of the flying boats. What I've put up first is basically a bit of a summary of the basic sections that I'll be covering off in this talk, which is covering the history, because I collect what Imperial Airways, which is the forerunner to BOAC, called the Eastern route, which is out to Australia and beyond. That's the area that I should be focusing on tonight. And as you can see there, the comment I've put for Kingsford Smith, who was the first pilot to successfully cross the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand. That was the most difficult and dangerous crossing in the world. And I'll cover off later why that therefore became one of the last elements that joined up the airmail routes in that part of the world. So firstly, a little bit about me, because quite often people say, you're a girl, why do you collect airmails? Well, the first and only thing I really have from when I first started collecting, which was back when I was 6, because my dad collected stamps. This is a postcard of Francis Chichester circumnavigating the world in Gypsy Moth IV. But what I didn't realise for many years until I started getting interested in airmails, Gypsy Moth was actually an aircraft, and Gypsy Moth I was, when he'd made his money in Christchurch, was the aircraft that he purchased and determined to fly around the world. As you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, he got as far as Japan and had a slight problem with an argument with the side of a riverbank, which stopped his flight around the world. My dad worked for Rolls-Royce airplane engines at Bristol, which is where I was born and spent the first few years of my life before moving to Cornwall. And that's a picture there of the end of the Concords at Filton and all the BAE staff there together. So that's really, I think, what put me towards aviation. It was the ability to tell a story, which as a themed collector we all like to do, and sort of building on my personal history. And when I was 11, I saw the first flight from Filton of the Concorde. So to start looking at the history of the flying boats, we got to start first of all with the crossing of the Tasman Sea, and that's back in 1928. So you've got there Kingsford Smith is the guy on the far right in the Southern Cross bread postcard, and with his crew, and they managed to cross through into New Zealand. Kingsford Smith is interesting, still on the theme of crossing around the world. He was the first person to circumnavigate the world in his aircraft, the Southern Cross, which you can see on the bottom right postcard. And it took him 3 years in different sections, but he finally completed it in 1930. And that was commemorated in 1931 by Australia issuing a set of stamps, for those of you who are familiar with those. And that's just the return flight. So back in this period, this is still the longest time it took to cross, which was 23 hours because of the appalling weather conditions. And that's a telegram that sent to the Sun newspaper. So it's a bit like Formula One racing in that era. The pioneer aviators needed to have plenty of sponsorship to enable them to make these long distance flights. And part of that sponsorship was the newspapers, because communication in this era, people didn't have mobile phones or the ability to instantly communicate. They relied very much on letters in the post. And that was the important thing to realize about early aviation and the start of the airmail services. It was very much about the mail contract. That was the key and critical thing, to get a mail contract which would pay you sufficient money to operate the air service. Passengers were really sort of the jam on top of that. And fast forwarding to 1933, so Imperial Airways was formed in 1924, And its whole reason for being was to buckle the empire together. So it was very much owned and operated by the government in the same way that BBC is. The chairman of Imperial Airways was a political appointment, and the whole point of them was that they would create air services as aircraft technology improved that went further and further around the world and around the empire, ensuring that mail was delivered as fast as possible, because it's not only families communicating, it's also commerce in making sure that business ran smoothly and information got to businesses as quickly as possible. So this is the first survey flight of an aircraft called the Astria. So we're not quite onto the flying boats as yet. And you've got Major Brackley there with his crew, and he was the superintendent of Imperial Airways. So this was a survey flight, but we will come across him shortly. And you can see the aircraft coming into land. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the Qantas hangar, and in front of it is the Astria. And if you look to the left, there's like a little white line, and that is what people knew an aircraft to be size-wise. So I think you can see the number of people there. That's quite a small number. Normally, with the survey flights, you'd expect 15, 20,000 people to turn up at the airport to greet the aircraft arriving. And the most amazing thing for them at this time was the actual size of the aircraft. And this is a map from 1935-6. So it's before the introduction of the flying boat service, but it just gives you an indication of the route that they operated by this stage. So in 1931, so you can see Cairo in the top left-hand corner. So Cairo was the hub where mail was exchanged. So the aircraft flew down to Cairo, and then you can either continue on to Cape Town, so that was from 1931, or you could continue out through India and beyond. So India, the first flights, regular flights, were 1929 by Imperial Airways, and they gradually extended through Singapore later that year, and then in December 34 right to Australia. They went as far as Brisbane, which is on the right sort of hand side of Australia, about halfway up. So that was the end terminus, and then there were contracts issued to local airlines to operate what was called a feeder service, so the mail could be flown to different parts. But you can see when you look at Australia, the aircraft is going across land, and we'll look at the changes that flying boats gave to the route after that. So this is basically the route by the mid-1930s, before the introduction of the Empire Airmail Scheme and the flying boats. But it's also useful to look at this from a wartime perspective. You might have heard the term the horseshoe route. And what that related to was the shape, as you can see outlined in red here, of the mail routes. So once Europe was cut off because of wartime conditions when Mussolini entered the war, so it wasn't safe for the mail carrying flights to continue over the sort of that section of the route. What happened was the mail would go up from Australia through India around to Cairo, back down to Cape Town, and there it would join a convoy of, so by ship, back to the UK. And that's why you've got what's called the horseshoe route. Obviously, that's a bit out of sync, but I wanted to explain it while you could see the map, so you could get an understanding of how the service operated and why. Qantas is a familiar name, I think, to everybody. It started operating in around 1923, but it went through quite a few different iterations. Hudson Fish was basically the chief operating officer and then chairman latterly. And it started off as a private company, but then Qantas Empire Airways was formed, and he basically was the operating officer, but the ownership was really through the three government, the Australian and the British government. So again, they weren't totally free to do everything that they wanted. And by 1947, BOAC shares were bought out, and it was nationalised. Ooh, sorry about that. Right. So again, this is November 34, the introduction of the first regular airmail service into Australia, but still not Empire Airmail Scheme and still not flying boats. And you can see here the latest times for posting. And then on the right, you've got an indication of the time scale it would take for, on average, for mail to get to you. So you're looking at 12 to 14 days and slightly beyond, depending what part of Australia you went to. Another week, because it was then a mail steamer service to get to New Zealand, and the Dutch East Indies was 9 days. Now, KLM, as you'll see in a minute, operated DC-2 metal aircraft, which were far superior to the ones that Imperial Airways was operating. Part of the reason for that was that they were bound to buy British. So they had no choice but to buy British aircraft, and they tended to go for the sort of perhaps older designed wooden hulled aircraft. So they did take a lot longer. We needed to, because the flying legs that the aircraft could operate in that era were a lot shorter than they would be today. They needed to land and refuel in Dutch East Indies. Therefore, the Australian government said to KLM, who wanted to introduce an air service far sooner than we were able to do with Imperial Airways, that they had to wait until Imperial Airways was ready. But part of that discussion process is we needed the landing rights to land in the Dutch East Indies, and they obviously needed our agreement to fly on and land in Australia. On the left is Peter Wingent, who is in Imperial Airways Study Circle with myself, spent a long, long time in the Imperial Airways stroke BOAC archives, looking at what was called the actual mail, how the aircraft actually performed. So not a timetable, they're aircraft movement charts. So what you had is a group of ladies with these huge ledgers, and they literally manually filled in what aircraft was where, what time it arrived, whether it had any mechanical problems that causes any delays. So really until the beginning of the Second World War, if your envelope has got sufficient information on it, i.e. a back stamp or annotated with an arrival time, you can generally link that envelope to a particular flight and a particular aircraft, which is really helpful. And you can see here for the first flight to Australia, the different aircraft that they employed. And particularly at the beginning, you see you've got Hengist and Horatius were both carrying mail. So you can find, particularly with the special flights and the number of people who wanted to carry philatelic mail, that you actually have two aircraft operating a similar route rather than just the one. And there's a cover from that flight. And again, this is quite interesting because it's coming from Mozambique, so an island off the right-hand middle right of Africa. And it was carried by a feeder service, not operated by a British. It was the SNAM, Service de la Navigation Aérienne de Madagascar. And that flew into Broken Hill, where it joined the Imperial Airways route up to Cairo and then down to Australia. So this was the first time you had that ability to sort of connect. And that's just some postcards showing the types of aircraft that were operated. The Hannibal class bottom right used to be called a flying banana because it wasn't particularly pleasant to fly in and made a lot of people quite unwell. And this is an example of what can happen on those sort of flights. This particular cover led quite an adventurous life. It had about, it wasn't unusual to have several different aircraft, but what was less usual is each of these aircraft seemed to have engine problems or something went wrong. And in the final case, when the pilot left the Dutch East Indies for Australia, he forgot to let, or couldn't be bothered to let Darwin know that he was going to arrive in the dark, with the result they didn't put the landing lights on, and he didn't. He was blown off course, landed on a beach, and then the rescue aircraft that went to refuel it again got damaged and had to be rescued. And the final insult for the cover was when it arrived, they hadn't put enough postage on. So the Department of Repatriation then had to pay the penalty for that. So that's what makes it quite interesting, I think, collecting these covers. You can look at the pilots, the planes, the story behind how it got there. And I briefly mentioned at the beginning, Kingsford Smith and Ullman was his co-pilot, were the first people to cross the Tasman Sea. So the New Zealand government by now was getting quite desperate, because Australia was now linked by this regular airmail service. They wanted, again, to be connected to the Empire in a better way by having an air service. And Imperial Airways wasn't then able to provide it. So what they were trying to do was find a competent pilot, which Ulm was, to operate a special flight, in this case, to pick up the mail. His secretary came back and said, really sorry, he's in America, and he was actually trying to set up a mail service across the Pacific. Unfortunately, in his aircraft on the sort of survey flight, it crash landed onto the ocean because they got lost and ran out of fuel. And it must have been dreadful, because you could hear the radio messages from the crew saying, come and get us, and they couldn't find them. So they were all killed. And of course, the bodies in the plane were never found. So, and again, that's the risk you took with flying. There wasn't the rescue, not just the rescue service in the 20s and early 30s. There wasn't one. The government wouldn't automatically come out and try and find you if you got into difficulty. Ulm by then was so famous that they did send the Navy out in a vain attempt to find them. But certainly in the late 1920s, when they were some of the flights they were pioneering flights they were doing, there was no rescue service, and it was left to people who knew them to get the money together and pay a pilot to privately go and look for them. And you also got Charles Kingsford Smith, although they flew together, by now they were completely separate and had no business relationship. And again, he wanted to set up a regular service to commute between New Zealand and Australia until a regular service could eventuate. He even invested a lot of money in producing a plane, again, because they were bound to buy British. And one of the reasons he failed was he realised that the most dependable aircraft was the DC-2, the Douglas metal aircraft, and it wasn't politically possible for the New Zealand and Australian governments to agree to provide to a non-British aircraft to operate the route. And again, he was killed shortly afterwards doing a record-breaking flight. So his involvement ceased from the mid 1935. So now we go back slightly to December 34. So that was when the first regular service eventuated. So the government, shortly after that, announced that they wanted to introduce a scheme, which they were going to do in stages, where the mail rate, instead of being something like different depending which country you were sending the mail to, and how much of it was by air and how much by surface, they were going to do a set or all-up rate, as they called it, throughout countries in the empire, and that was going to be penny halfpenny per half ounce. So instead of one and threepence, one and sixpence, say, you were going to have a much reduced cost in sending mail, and they knew that would be an enormous uplift in the amount of mail being carried by the aircraft. So they had to design an aircraft that was capable of carrying more, and that's where the flying boat came in. I think also you have to think of the cost of operating runways. You have to set them up. You need people to man them. And I think part of that was their decision with making for having a flying boat was you didn't need such a huge infrastructure you do with a physical land airport, because they could land in the river, a lake, or the sea. And this is quite a nice sort of cutout where you can see the mail sacks towards the front, and then you can see the passengers as you go backwards. I mean, I think they do show bunk beds on there, but what used to happen with the land plane service as well as the flying boats, they didn't really fly at night. What happened is if you were a passenger on these, it was very much a luxury first class experience, a bit like the Orient Express would be for us today. And going to Australia, you're talking probably about £250, and that would probably have bought you a house then. So it wasn't a service for everybody. Only people wealthy enough to afford that sort of money would have flown on it. You did get some reduction for example, service personnel flying to and from India, but it certainly wasn't an open to all service as far as passengers are concerned. And here you can see from a postcard, it was quite a luxurious set out with quite a lot of space. You had a promenade deck, you could smoke because it's not pressurized like we would be today. And you can see the first flying boat there on the ramp at Short Brothers at Rochester. It's quite interesting also seeing the controls with the vision that they would have had from the cockpit. And we also have to realise in this era, you had some instrumentation, but it was quite a visual thing, landing and taking off. And you could also get stationery, like the bridge scorecard here, letters, headeds, and also what tended to happen if you were flying somewhere like the pyramids, Niagara Falls, or whatever, the pilot would actually take time to circle so the passengers could view what they were seeing below. You know, for example, if you're going across Africa, if there was a herd of elephants or whatever. So it was quite an individual experience for people. And again, that's just a slightly more up-to-date post office notice. But it just gives you an idea of the cost of postage before the introduction of the Empire Airmail Scheme. As you can see, it was a weekly service for Australia on the Saturday. And here's an example of a cover from the introduction of one of the flying boats. So again, they were introduced in stages. And there's a close-up of the aircraft that carried the cover. As you can see them, how it sits on the water, and you can see quite close to how big the engines were. One of the reasons that New Zealand didn't get flying boats very quickly was pilots spent about a week being trained. So an experienced pilot, you had a full-on training course. You learnt how to sail a boat because they were used to flying an aircraft and landing on land. But landing on water, they needed to know a lot more about how the tides worked, the wind speed. So they started off sailing a boat, then they flew an old flying boat, an old type, and then they were put into a C-class flying boat, and that's why the names of all the aircraft start with a C, because that was their designation. But unfortunately, things didn't always go great. I mean, even with the land planes, there were quite a lot of accidents in that era because it was still learning about what safety, and also there was a lot of room for pilot error, particularly the misjudging of landing heights. And you, as in the case with this crash, I mean, I do love the cover because it's addressed to a Miss Soggy. And of course, being a flying boat, they tended to crash into water. And you used to get visions of all these envelopes laid out on a beach somewhere exotic, being dried off before they could be sorted and returned to sender or sent on to the recipient, if they could there was enough information to enable them to do it. And a lot of people do collect crash and disaster mail, and you can see here in the middle of bottom of the cover all the different cancellations that you could receive on the mail. And here's a different one. This is the maiden flight of the Centaurus, and that was flown between Alexandria and Marseille. And the Centaurus was chosen to do what was then the longest survey flight ever, and that was out to New Zealand. So the government at long last was listening to the representations of the New Zealand government, but also they'd introduced a new class of flying boat. So previously you had the S-23, and this is an S, so which this still is, but the new flying boats were going to be S-30s, so they had a longer range, bigger engines, more suited to flying the longer distances, such as the transatlantic flights and out to New Zealand. And here you've got a cover from the survey flight. And that's quite interesting. If you look at Colin Elder, who was the first officer, they both had to have the air navigator qualifications, and they were obviously had to learn and know how to use a sextant. And that's you can see him there operating it. And you can see the Centaurus there in Auckland Harbour, and a cover that I don't think was flown because it hasn't got enough of the back stamps. So I think whilst it was accepted with a survey flight, mail could be carried by favour of the pilot, and it invariably was. But if you didn't know the pilot, or you weren't, say, a well-known stamp dealer, which the majority of the covers on these sort of flights were carried by them, as in this case, I don't think it was actually put on the aircraft. And of course, certainly with the private pilots, maybe not so much with Imperial Airways, they did charge. I know Ulm charged 2 and 6 if he signed a cover. So this is where Pan American comes in as well. So we've looked at the moment of the Imperial Airways route, but Pan American Airways also had ambitions. And in fact, in the mid-1930s, when we come on to look at the Pacific during the war, both the British and Americans sent their navies out in the mid-30s to sort of claim different bits of rock in the Pacific Ocean, which is why you had things like Canton Island, Kingman Reef, Midway were claimed, I think, during this period. And it was mainly because they knew they would want to set up an air service, but they needed places where the planes could land and refuel. And so this is a cover from the Pan Am archives with a special black cancellation, which was carried, and you can see the Captain Muzak on the left there, by him on the first survey flight. And the photograph shows in the foreground you've got the Pan Am Samoan clipper, and you can tell because its sort of nose is a bit more pointed, and then you've got the Centaurus in the background there. And it's quite a sad story really, because on the third flight in the Samoan clipper, They'd let a lot of fuel out, which had let fumes into the aircraft. And on the third flight, it caused it to explode with the loss of everybody on board. So quite a tragic ending, and it stopped Pan Am introducing a regular mail service for 3 more years. And whilst they were in New Zealand, they did what's called a goodwill flight. I was fortunate enough to acquire that's a ticket, a flight ticket, from the guy, if you look in the middle at the back there, I think was a Captain Stuart French, and he was on the survey flight accompanying the governor, and these are the photographs he took while he was on board. It took me a while to find out a bit about him because I didn't realise Stuart French was his surname. I thought it was Christian name and surname, but once I realised that, his medals were sold, which gave a bit about his personal history. Because you can see here, I thought, oh, he's a pilot because he sat there with a pilot's cap on, but actually he was military captain. And it's quite sad. Not long after that, he married, and at the start of the war, he and his new wife got a boat to go back to Ireland, and it was torpedoed, and she was killed. And they'd only been married about 3 weeks, I think. So it's pretty sad period. But what's interesting in the photographs, you can see it's quite compact at the front there, but you can see the instrumentation and the view from the front of the aircraft. And you can see the proper press photos at the top, and then more of his personal photos, and you can see the reception committee waiting for them on a pontoon there. And you can see, you could buy, if you look in the bottom right, you can see the little boat. So where they couldn't land and passengers disembarked directly onto a pontoon, Imperial Airways had boats which they put in various places, and they would go and collect the passengers and mail or what have you and take them to the shore. And you can see them there, obviously looking at a map and laughing over it. And you've got Commander Burgess there on the right, who is the pilot. And then there's finally a cover over the harbour at Adelaide. It must have been quite something to see, I think. Also in the 30s, you had special blue airmail boxes produced in London, so you could put your mail in and with special collections. So it's quite a nice leaflet there with good graphics. And the Empire Airmail Scheme, it wasn't just the aircraft that were introduced in stages, the actual mail and the cost of posting it was. So you had stage 1, which was Africa, and I don't particularly collect that area. So what we're looking at now is the section that goes on to India. But as you can see from the list, it does include countries outside of that, and just confirmation of how much it was going to cost. The other thing that's of note is the fact, because everything was going to be carried by air, you didn't need to use an airmail label because it was an automatic thing. So there were a few changes for people to get used to. And there's some examples of covers that were flown on the survey flight of the Coogee, and that was out to India in February 38. And the bit on the right is one of a file copy of the letter from the postmaster at Cawnpore detailing some of the stages. And you can see the bottom cover is not only one that was carried on the survey flight, but it's also got the special cancellation there because it was sent out to South Africa, so it was carried on the first flight under the Empire Airmail Scheme. And there you are from the aircraft movement charts on the left. And that's a letter from Imperial Airways at Baghdad talking about the introduction of the all-up scheme and what changes that would make and what aircraft were arriving then. I mean, it's interesting to think today, Baghdad would have is probably a huge airport with multiple flights in a day, whereas here you're looking at 3 or 4 flights a week each way. But Qantas at that point didn't have its own flying boats, so it was operating a DH-86, which you can see illustrated in that postcard. And there's a cover that went on the first flight of the Empire Airmail Scheme under stage 2, but because it was going to Australia, which wasn't in the scheme at the time, they still had to pay the 1 3/8 rate and put the Airmail label on, of course, as well. And here you can see an illustration of one of the flying boats that Qantas was going to receive in Australia. So the arrangement when the contracts were signed back in 1934 for the airmail flights to Australia was that Imperial Airways would fly out as far as Singapore, and then Qantas would take over from there. So though the flying boats might be interchangeable, the actual crews weren't. And here's an example of a feeder service. So this is a cover from Australia, but it's going into Austria. So mail coming out of England would have been carried by what was then called British Airways, which was the sort of European hub. So they would, from Britain, mail going into Europe would have been carried by them, whereas coming back from Australia, it would be carried by the Imperial Airways service, stroke Qantas, under contract. And then in this case, when it got to Athens, it would transfer into the DLH service through to Berlin and Vienna. Of course, at this stage, Austria had been annexed by Germany as well in the March. And you can see there's a special cancel there, Australia to Greece, to show the routing that they wanted to send it. But I do like sort of things like that because I always think they're a bit more interesting when you can learn about the service. And here we've got the first flying boat service out to Australia. So that's July 38. And I've shown a picture from the scan of the aircraft movement chart so you can see the aircraft used. So it would be unusual to have the same aircraft throughout. Normally, they did a section and then a new aircraft would take over from there. And also the service, if you remember in December 34, I said the land planes went as far as Brisbane. Now the route was being extended to Sydney. And this is now stage 3 of the Empire scheme and the final stage, and that shows the mail going into Australia. Now, looking at the map here, as well as the line on the leaflet, that shows the original route going across land. However, with the flying boats, the routing changed. So instead of going across land, they skirted the coast. So you ended up going right across the top with a stop at Townsville and also a brand new stop, which is Hout Island, for the flying boats. And if you look at the right-hand side of the map, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, just so you can get the geography, you've got Fiji and you've got Tonga to the right of it. So again, they were part of the Commonwealth. The postage rates up to now, I've said it's a penny halfpenny under the Empire Airmail Scheme. So mail from Fiji, which is part of the Empire, and New Zealand could go back to England at a cost of penny halfpenny per half ounce. However, Australia, because the internal airmail rate there was 5p, refused to go so low. And so if you're in Australia, it would cost you 5p. to post mail under the Empire Airmail Scheme. And this is an invitation and inaugural ceremony for the flying boat service to Australia, New Zealand, and beyond. But although they're putting all those countries in, effectively the air service was Australia, and beyond that would have been by sea. And there you can see one of the pilots with the special mail. So what tended to happen if you had VIP mail, you'd have a nice small little sack with all the details printed on it, and that would be handed over specially for transmission to the recipients, who were normally sort of government ministers, etc. And Imperial Airways produced their own marketing envelopes and letters, and this is an example there. It's normally a foolscap-sized long oblong envelope, but I've had to truncate it to get it onto the page so you can see the letter. And here's an example of a double rate cover. As I said, it was per half ounce. So this is a 1 ounce letter, so the rate is 10p going back to England. And also they had a special cancellation which they introduced, as you can see up there in the top right hand corner, reminding people of the postage rates. And these are test letters. As you can see, they're addressed to the traffic manager in Sydney and in London. And what they basically used to do was to test the operation of the system, particularly where a new service was being introduced. They posted letters to each other and then checked off how quickly they were being delivered. So they're quite interesting. And it's also, you can see penny halfpenny, 5p. It's a good illustration of the differences in rates between Australia and the rest of the empire. And as you can see here, what I was alluding to before, the route changed now, so it was going along the coast, and you've got a cover there from the first flight from Hout Island, and then a picture of the plane at Townsville. I've included this. I will skip through it because you won't want to read all of this, but Major Brackley, if you remember, was the guy that is the air superintendent for Imperial Airways, and he did the survey flight way back in 1933 of the Astria out to Australia. Rudder, who wrote the letter, is the Imperial Airways agent in Australia, and this is going back before the introduction of the scheme, saying, well, where are we going to put the flying boats in Sydney? Because they needed a water to land in, and there was the harbour area there, but there was various locations, and the port authorities basically didn't know what they were doing, according to the letter, which is understandable because they'd never had to cope with a flying boat before. So you can see there's quite a bit advantages, disadvantages, and his response about what resources would be required. So you can see it's quite a detailed correspondence. And they did eventually go to Rose Bay. I was actually there in 2019, and there still is the building, which is now a restaurant, with a bit like Greenwich, you have a flagpole with all the distances to various parts of the world. But this is one of my favourite little leaflets showing the flying boat, and it's issued by Qantas, saying we've now moved our base from Brisbane to Sydney, obviously because that was now the end of the flying boat route, and it was also Sydney would become the stopping off point for an eventual air service beyond to New Zealand as well. And this is the opening of the flying boat base, and you can see the special cancellation that has been placed on the mail for that, and a couple of examples showing Rose Bay. And here's a magazine cut out from a magazine, which gives you a really good view of Rose Bay, and it doesn't look massively, well, certainly in 2019, what the arrows pointing was where the restaurant still is, and there's still a bit of a park with a lot more parking now. But what I like about this is Lord Huntingfield cut the ribbon, and I managed to get this cover, which is a lot scruffier than the other one. But what's nice is the contents of the letter, which I've reproduced there, confirming that Lord Huntingfield was going to be doing the opening ceremony as acting Governor General. It's always nice to sort of get a bit extra with these things. And then the service was extended to 3 times a week. So again, rather philatelic, but it's quite a nice cover. And it's addressed to Quinn Harkin, who was the chief accountant for Imperial Airways. And that's just an example of the timetable for the route, and also a little book of airmail labels. But that's from 1940, so I'll come on to why airmail labels would be used in a moment. And this is, I've got the archive of a guy called Len Turnhill, and he originally worked for Kingsford Smith, but when the airline folded in 1931, he returned home to Britain and started work for Imperial Airways, who sent him around the world. And he was an engineer who basically went around all the different bases, checking up and making sure everything was okay. And he was appointed to create the flying boat base out in Auckland. And the letter I always found quite interesting, because it talks there about how much he was going to be receiving, what allowances he was going to get, and a copy of the newspaper article, which goes back to 1938 in August, saying the plans are underway for a provision of modern services. And he pretty much kept everything, which is fortunate for me. So this is a bit of the advertising from Imperial Airways press release, talking about him being sent out. But as I put the little blue arrow, it says he's going to be putting in a new type of floating jetty, which is called the Braby Pontoon. And the only other one in the world at the time was the one at Southampton, which you can see here with the aircraft. I'm never quite sure whether it's going in or coming out, but I think it possibly is coming in. But it just gives you an impression of how complex an arrangement it was for these flying boats to keep them in, because one of the reasons they had so many problems, they're not particularly thick-skinned, so if they hit the ground quite or the water quite hard, they did tend to break open. And there's a picture of what Len has done. So this is out in Waitemata Harbour in Auckland, and the Braby Pontoon there. And yet another press release, because now you've got the flying boat base. And I think also the date is quite significant in 1939, because the government must have, but all the governments knew that war was imminent. And from a how on earth do we get communications up and running if there's a problem in Europe, had already determined that a backdoor route would be via Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific, back through America and across the Atlantic. And that became known as the Two Ocean Mail. So here you can see they're announcing that there's going to be 3 flying boats sent out to operate a Tasman service from Auckland to Sydney and vice versa. And Captain Burgess, who we saw in the survey flight of the Centaurus, is captaining this. So again, we've now moved on to an S30, so a slightly bigger flying boat, but they look pretty much the same. As you can see there, they're quite big. So there's your double-decker bus. And that's the Centaurus, so the older type of aircraft. And the third aircraft they mentioned, the Australia, never actually was put into service on that route because they lost so many flying boats. It was retained and operated elsewhere in the Empire. And this is a cover from the survey delivery flight of the Aotearoa. It actually had three names. It got original British name, then it was renamed the Awarua, but because it was available before the other aircraft, they swapped the name. So this one was called the Aotearoa, and that means land of the low white cloud in Maori. And that's an example of a cover, again from the survey flight. And that actually went all the way from Australia to New Zealand and back again. And one of the reasons was Captain Burgess, or whoever was responsible for them, obviously shoved them somewhere out the way for the delivery flight, and only realised they had them before the aircraft took off again to do a survey flight out to Fiji, and which is why I wanted you to have a look on the map, just so you could get an idea of the geography, because I think the government was thinking, whatever happens, Imperial Airways will operate a service out across the Pacific. And this is it here. And the mail is quite interesting. The two covers I've got, I suppose, were sent in the knowledge that they would be going on a flying boat, but there was quite a lot of mail that was carried because the steamer hadn't arrived, because by now in October 39 we were at war, and the steamer hadn't arrived. There was a backlog of mail, so the flying boat took it at no, so there was no superscriptions on the mail and there was no surcharge for it. This is one of a few covers that was carried over to Tonga, so it went back to Fiji, across to Tonga, and then back to Auckland. And again, this is a cover that was carried from Tonga back to Auckland. And this is quite interesting because there was a letter in it, and the guy that wrote it was allowed to go on the flying boat for a demonstration flight. And I've written his description there, so I'll just leave the screen there. If you look at the bottom paragraph, or the bottom two paragraphs, he's written about his experience. And as he ends there, he's able to walk about and look out and go up into the control room, which of course today, because of all the terrorism, etc., is unfortunately something beyond all of us. But then you literally had the freedom of the flight. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. And this is a letter from Union Airways. Union Airways in New Zealand operated the feeder services. So once the flying boat came in with the mail for elsewhere in New Zealand, it was transferred to a Union Airways aircraft and sent on from there. And he's just thanking Len for his service, but he was also on the survey flight. So when the Aotearoa got to Auckland, it went back to Sydney with Len and him on board to check the aircraft out, and then came back again. And the reason it was doing the survey flights was they needed the second aircraft to come out before they could operate a service. They couldn't do it with one aircraft. And that again was thanking him for his service with Imperial Airways and saying, this is what's going to happen when you return. Now, the date, March 1940, is significant because with effect from the 1st of April, Imperial Airways was renamed BOAC. And on the declaration of war, the flying boats base had moved from Southampton to Poole, and the land planes had moved to Whitchurch in Bristol. And finally, you've got the delivery flight of the second aircraft, and you can see there the postcard showing the pilots and the crew with their wives. I mean, it's quite surprising in bearing in mind they were flying in the war period, as it left March 1940. It's quite surprising that they took their wives with them. But they were going to be based out there, so I would imagine, obviously, that's partly why they wanted their wives to come. And this is when Teal, or Tasman Empire Airways, was created. So there's two stamps there for the 75th anniversary. And this is confirmation on the declaration of war. The Empire Airmail Scheme ended. So you're back now to having to use an airmail label and different rates depending on where you were trying to send the mail. So you've got your 30th of April 1940 was the first flight of the regular airmail service across the Tasman Sea, and that is a congratulatory telegram from Fergus McMaster, who was chairman of Qantas and had been since the beginning, to Hudson Fysh, who was his chief operating officer, and he carried on until I think Hudson Fysh finally retired in the early 1960s. And there's examples of mail. So you've got an envelope, which is 1 and 6, and a postcard, which is 9p, with a special cancellation. And then you've got between New Zealand and Sydney, the government's agreed that the postage rate would remain at 5p. And that's just an example. It's a bit waterlogged of a baggage label that was carried on the flight as well. And then you've got the second flight, which is the Awarua, and that's just examples of mail from that. Because you didn't get special cancellations for the second flight, I mean, these are fairly philatelic, but it's difficult to sometimes to confirm that something was carried on a particular flight if you don't get the back stamps or certain other things. So at least with these, you've got this pilot signed, and it's it was on that flight. So now we've got mail going through to New Zealand, and we're during the war. How do you get mail beyond if you don't want it to go into the area of conflict that was in Europe? So the answer was the Pan American service. As I said, when Captain Muzak in 1937 was killed, that halted a regular airmail service being set up. But there was another option, which was via Hong Kong. And I like this cover because you've got a map on it, so it gives you a bit of an idea of the route that it was carried on, which is really across the top of the Pacific as far as New Zealand and Australia are concerned. FAM is for an airmail route. So with Pan Am, you've got FAMs and the number of the route, or you've got CAMs, which were the internal contract airmail routes. So that's just an example, again, going back to 37, of mail carried on that route. And you've also got FAM 18, which is the transatlantic mail. And that was a sort of southern transatlantic route. Not the northern one came in August 39, which was really going across the top to Newfoundland and down into New York. Whereas this was kind of across more of the middle through the Azores and going to Lisbon and Marseille. So this is pre-war at the moment. Once war was declared, Pan Am, as a neutral country, could not fly into France or Britain, and therefore Lisbon became extremely important because that was a neutral country. So you got the aircraft for all the belligerent countries could go into there and exchange mail. And that's why the change in this route, as you can see here, it's gone to Marseille, but once war was declared, the route ended at Lisbon. And this is one of two known covers that was carried before the Pan Am route came into being and the basic rate was 8 shillings. So you think within a very short time, you've gone from a penny halfpenny per half ounce to 8 shillings. And we know it's gone through Hong Kong because it's got the Hong Kong centre mark and the Hong Kong back stamp. Sadly, it's not got any other back stamps, so it's difficult to know how quickly it got through. And I do wonder if it actually ended up going with the first regular service through Pan Am, which would have been slightly cheaper for it. But it just gives you an idea of how difficult it was for people in this era to actually communicate with their loved ones or commercially, and what they went through to try and get the mail through. And Lawrence has agreed I can use this map from he's written a brilliant book about the Pacific airmail services, but it just gives you an idea of some of the complexities of the route, the changes, and how things had to change due to the war conditions. Because you can see in the top left, you've got Chongqing. So you had a period when mail went through China, because China was our ally, I can't even say that now, ally, and operated a service across the Himalayas through Hong Kong. But then, of course, Hong Kong fell and Singapore fell, so that closed that section of the route. And then, of course, you've got Pearl Harbor happening. So again, the route, the airmail route was cancelled at that point. So, but we're in that interim period at the moment where we're coming sort of April 40, you're looking at Mussolini was about to enter the war, and that triggered the horseshoe route and the end of the phony war. But at the moment, we're just looking at the Pacific. And so instead of 8 shillings now, using the Pan Am route through to San Francisco and then across America and then across the transatlantic, it's 6 shillings and threepence. So it's not a huge reduction. And you can see there that's the Clipper. So slightly different looking flying boat. And then you've got a cover going into Canada. And I suppose it's important also to understand that censorship and space on aircraft had a massive impact on what was carried. For example, Imperial Airways across the Atlantic, I don't think really carried mail because it needed all the space it could get for military communications and military personnel that they needed to transport. So it tended to be Pan Am to Lisbon. And again, you get back stamps on arrival, which is why I like New Zealand and India. Unfortunately, with Britain, you don't, unless it's a redirected material item. So you know the sort of roughly from the timetables how long individual sections of a route took, but it's very difficult sometimes to identify the plane and the flight that took them. And in fact, from 1943-ish onwards, you sort of kind of lose that link anyway. Sometimes you can be lucky. Other times I've got one cover where it's got fairly definite back stamps, but 5 or 6 aircraft arrived within days of each other. So I'll never know which aircraft they were carried on. But with these, I've had a reasonably good opportunity to say I think this is how they were carried, because they took a reasonably similar time to get through. And then you've got the horseshoe route, which if you remember I showed you on the original map, starting up, and this is July 1940, so it's not carried on the first flight. And these are quite interesting. I used to work for Barclays Bank, so I quite like if I can find a Barclays cover. But these are Indian stamps, and you kind of think, oh, well, that's obviously Indian mail, but it's not gone anywhere near India. It's an FPO 90, and when you look at the back, you see it's going from Barclays in Eritrea to Barclays in Uganda, and that was down to Barclays being asked to go into Eritrea because the Indian army mainly had driven out the Italians that had been in occupation there, and they needed to introduce obviously banking services. So quite often in those circumstances, you get stamps of different countries. Obviously, the Indian Army is using their stamps initially. You get British stamps on mail as well. So that what makes that quite interesting. And it was carried throughout Africa by now on the BOAC service. And this is quite nice as well. If you look at the blue stamp, the lady, it's a well-known what's called cigarette floor. And there's a little white cloud in front of her to the right of her mouth, which looks like she's blowing cigarette smoke. But what I find interesting about this is it's from the Free French delegation going to a lieutenant in Ismailia. And I went online, I could find a daily diary from the Navy about what was happening in this period, which was the sort of first Battle of Tobruk, when we sort of fell back. And I think he might have been based in headquarters. You can see it's been doubly censored in Africa, South Africa, and on arrival in Egypt. And it was obviously a time of great upheaval because of the military campaigns that were happening at the time. And this is one that was carried via New Zealand. And it's nice because you don't get very many postcards being sent. And it's actually from stamp dealer to stamp dealer, talking about currency control and the fact that they had to cancel their order because the control said they couldn't order something unless they'd ordered it the year before. So I find that sort of thing, again, quite interesting. And then there's just some more examples of double rate cover and a single rate. So originally it was 6 and threepence, and then because of the volumes of mail, they reduced it slightly because there was separate mail bags. So Australia was 5 and 10 and New Zealand was 5 and 9. And then Fiji got added to the route on the 9th of November 1941. So it's a nice cancellation there. And if you look at the red stamp, that's the one where nobody's sailing it, apparently. I knew nothing about it until I showed it physically to a group one day, and they said, "Did you realise?" And I thought, no, because I never look at the stamps. Whoop. Yeah, so, and then you've got example here from going to Britain to India. And again, this is what's called the two ocean mail. So it's gone across, if you think where India is, it's gone from England across the Atlantic, across America, across the Pacific, New Zealand to Australia, to Africa, and up to India. So it's pretty much gone round the world. However, it was posted on the 11th of December 1941. So what happened a few days before that was, of course, Pearl Harbor. So the post office authorities, because that route was now ended, would put it on the next best available option that didn't cost them any more money. So it would have gone via the horseshoe route and taken 4 to 6 weeks, which ties in with December and arrival beginning of February. And this is quite nice. This is an American postage authority. I think stamps were attached to it. It was like a little mini sheet which I got in the post at work. But I just like that sort of thing because it just gives you an indication of what was happening in 1941 and the different areas of where battles were happening. As you can see, it's probably one of the lowest points of the war for us. And there you've got a cover that should have been flown to Fiji, but because the Pacific service had been suspended, it would have gone by mail steamer. And this is quite nice. As I said, it's not always possible to tell what flight mail was carried on, but in Proud's book, he lists all the different Tasman flights, and in this case, you've got trip number AE104X, and that's nice because that particular day, I think because of Pearl Harbor, and obviously a massive amount of people were trying to communicate, you've got an extra flight. And you do have to wonder why, when you've got, with everything else that was going on, that he had the time or the energy to sign and provide a sort of certificate that you would normally expect to see in peacetime. But it's a lovely thing. I've not seen another one like it. And it's a particularly, I suppose, important time in our history. I mean, the Tasman services weren't impacted, but it was the Pacific services obviously were because of the areas of war. And this is from 1943. This is a flight ticket for Fergus McMaster, the chairman of Qantas, and he also kept the baggage tags that goes with it. So the flight references were E and W for east and west for your direction of travel. And it's got a nice stamp duty label on it as well. And that's just a commercial piece of mail and a picture of the aircraft. And we're now sort of just in the post-war period. So the C-class flying boats were showing their age. And this is the final flight of the Aotearoa, and a little magazine article which confirmed that it was then used as a tea room, which is really quite a sad end to an amazing aircraft. Unfortunately, none of the C-class flying boats have survived. The nearest is the teal one at Solent Sky at Southampton, which is a post-war. And then you've got the Tasman class was introduced just after the war. So you can see it's a different shaped nose. And that's just a menu from its inauguration. And some various bits of ephemera there. The ticket, a Christmas greetings, and a little card showing your speed. And one of my favourite things is the cotton wool for your ears. And I do like when you open it up, it's got lend us your ears. I can't imagine them handing that out today. And this is a Qantas label, but Imperial Airways and BOAC did them as well. So they went on for, they've been going for years. So if you were, still a first class passenger service effectively. So every night when you stayed over, you got a card and it told you exactly when you'd be picked up the following morning, what the meal arrangements were. And this is obviously for the Raffles Hotel and what your room was going to be. I said it not only first class flying, it was also first class staying overnight as well. And the priorities board, wartime and post-war, as you remember, rationing didn't finish until the early 1950s. Neither did this. The Ministry of Supply controlled the aircraft that you were able to order, and it also controlled the number of passengers that were flown on the aircraft. Increasingly, as the post-war period, they reserved fewer seats, but you still, certainly mid-war, you had to go to London, you had to have an interview and prove that you were important enough to be carried on a flight. And you could still be bumped off if somebody even more important turned up. And this is quite nice because by post-war you had a split. You had the you could fly with a land plane or you could fly with a flying boat. And this person actually had a bit of each. And he's thanking Hudson Fish for enabling him to have priority. So he didn't have to wait to get the flying boat to England. John Stroud was an aviation journalist who wrote a lot of books and articles, and here he's written to Tasman asking for information about the flying boats, and you can see there where they've put that in. And this is quite nice. It's a late 1940s commercial cover from Teal to Germany. And that's really just sort of saying from October 48, mail was divided into zones rather than countries. So Europe was zone 3, which is pretty much what we have today. And that's just another Short Brothers confirmation of the Solent flying boats here. And you can see there you've still got one called Aotearoa, and there's examples of cards with pictures of the aircraft and some of the sort of flights that they did post-war. And this is the final slide, Bon Voyage with Teal. I do like these leaflets. You've got some fabulous graphics and pictures of the aircraft. So that is it. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was really most, well, yes, where do I start? It was such a lot of information in there and some wonderful material there. I really liked a lot of those envelopes. I think were wonderful. The maps. I think that little drawing to put the things into size of the wing on top of the going over top of a London bus. You know, really, we can all imagine that must have been huge. Would be impressive today, let alone then. It would be wonderful sights. And how close it is. I wouldn't say it's in living memory of anybody here, but it's pretty close.
I mean, I've had a lot of people say to me at Calshot, remember seeing the aircraft stored there, which I would imagine are probably the post-war ones rather than the pre-war ones. But I suppose that's the biggest sadness, really, is the fact that we haven't, the nearest we've got isn't, is a post-war version, not the C-class. They did make some, at least one person made strong efforts to try and get governments to agree to keep one, but I think it was just lack of resources post-war, unfortunately, meant that they just rotted away.
Okay, are there any questions for Sue? Would you like to wave at me or just go for it?
Did I just comment on the French, the cover from going into the French naval officer in Alexandria? You went too quick and I couldn't jot down the name of the ship. But at that point in time, I think it was 1942, the French ships in Alexandria had actually been interned and were under the control of...
It wasn't addressed to a ship.
But it was still a French officer in Alexandria, which suggests he's possibly one of the seamen on one of the interned ships.
I think he's more likely to have been at headquarters, but you could well be right.
It could be Free French, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was from a Free French legation in Cape Town.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, that answers my comment.
Thanks, Jim.
I mean, not that I know a great deal about that element. I mean, that's the difficulty with such a massive topic, is I've just been trying to break it down, hopefully into sort of more understandable chunks by focusing on the route that I collect, rather than every possible route that you had during the war. 'Cause I don't really touch the Atlantic services or the services from West Africa across to Miami.
Any other questions for Sue? No, I'm not seeing any. Okay, perhaps we
Yeah.
could express. Oh, sorry, Peter.
Well, just one. At a certain point, you mentioned a couple that were test letters,
Yes.
and I suspect, well, I may have missed it on the write-up because it was one of the very first covers, about second or third, was addressed to a Mr. Dolby, and I think that might be a test letter.
It could well be, but I think he was also a collector.
Right. Well, I mean, I'll tell you why.
I don't disagree with you.
I've got a couple of railway air service ones within Britain, which will be an earlier date, addressed to Dolby, and a previous owner had put on that they were test letters, and I did ask someone who knows about airmails, which I didn't really, and he sort of confirmed it. So that might be worth.
Yeah, I mean, it possibly could be as well. We did have I belong to the Imperial Airways Study Circle, and we did have a debate on our last call. What were test letters for? Because there's no real formal information on them, and it's difficult to find. If Peter, who'd done so much research on Imperial Airways, was struggling, then there's no hope for the rest of us. But I think it basically came down to is if they were introducing a new route or service, they tended to instigate them. But equally, I have a test cover, which I didn't show, which went by sea mail. So they were obviously, presumably, trying to test what surface services were like, as opposed to air services. I don't know why they would want to do that, but I've got one, and I haven't seen another one like it. So,
well, anyway, I'd say the Airmail Society might might be worth it. Anyway, I just wanted to I put it forward for what it's worth.
No, thank you.
Jan, you had a question.
Yes, fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I learned a lot. I've got a question, however, from the other side of the globe, the service between Newfoundland and Ireland.
Yes.
Would you be able to recommend any reading for me to learn more on that?
That's a very good question. There is a book called Shooting Stars and Sons, I think it's called, and that details all the flights from Portmarnock, which is Dublin. That's a good one. It's not an area I collect myself. There's probably Imperial Airways books that you could find a bit more on. Do you want to send me an email, or if you send it to Wendy, she'll send it on to me.
Okay.
To remind me and what sort of period you're looking at, and I'll see if I can find something for you. But certainly the Shooting Sons one, it's only a little sort of pamphletty book, but that's got a lot of information on the flights from Portmarnock.
That's great. Thank you very much.
That's okay.
So unless there's another question, can we show our appreciation to Sue for her talk?
Thank you very much.
Okay.